I think what a joy it is to be alive, and I wonder if I'll ever leap inward to the root of this flesh and know myself as once I was. The root is there. Whether any act of mine can find it, that remains tangled in the future. But all things a man can do are mine. Any act of mine may do it. The Gola speaks. Alia's commentary. As he lay immersed in the screaming odour of the spice, staring inward through the oracular trance, Paul saw the moon become an elongated sphere. It rolled and twisted, hissing, the terrible hissing of a star being quenched in an infinite sea, down, 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 like a ball thrown by a child. It was gone. This moon had not set. Realization engulfed him. It was gone. No moon. The earth quaked like an animal shaking its skin. Terror swept over him. Paul jerked upright on his pallet, eyes wide open, staring. Part of him looked outward, part inward. Outwardly he saw the plasmold grillwork which vented his private room, and he knew he lay beside a stone-like abyss of his keep. Inwardly he continued to see the moon fall. Out. Out. His grillwork of plasmold looked onto the blazing light of noon across Arakeen. Inward there lay blackest night. A shower of sweet odours from a garden roof nibbled at his senses, but no floral perfume could roll back that fallen moon. Paul swung his feet to the cold surface of the floor, peered through the grillwork. He could see directly across to the gentle arc of a footbridge constructed of crystal-stabilized gold and platinum. Fire jewels from far Sedon decorated the bridge. It led to the galleries of the inner city across a pool and fountain filled with waterflowers. If he stood, Paul knew, he could look down into petals as clean and red as fresh blood whirling, turning there, discs of ambient colour tossed on an emerald freshet. His eyes absorbed the scene without pulling him from spice thraldom, that terrible vision of a lost moon. The vision suggested a monstrous loss of individual security. Perhaps he'd seen a civilization fall, toppled by its own pretensions. A moon, a falling moon. It had taken a massive dose of the spice essence to penetrate the mud thrown up by the tarot. All it had shown him was a falling moon in the hateful way he'd known from the beginning. To buy an end for the jihad, to silence the volcano of butchery, he must discredit himself. Disengage, disengage, disengage. Floral perfume from the garden roof reminded him of Chani. He longed for her arms now, for the clinging arms of love and forgetfulness. But even Chani could not exorcise this vision. What would Chani say if he went to her with the statement that he had a particular death in mind? Knowing it to be inevitable, why not choose an aristocrat's death, ending life on a secret flourish, squandering any years that might have been? To die before coming to the end of willpower, was that not an aristocrat's choice? He stood, crossed to the lapped opening in the grillwork, went out onto a balcony which looked upward to flowers and vines trailing from the garden. His mouth held the dryness of a desert march. Moon. Moon. Where is that moon? He thought of Alia's description, the young woman's body found in the dunes. A Fremen addicted to Samuta. Everything fitted the hateful pattern. You do not take from this universe, he thought. It grants what it will. The remains of a conch shell from the seas of Mother Earth lay on a low table beside the balcony rail. He took its lustrous smoothness into his hands, tried to feel backward in time. The pearl surface reflected glittering moons of light. He drew his gaze from it, peered upward past the garden to a sky become a conflagration. Trails of rainbow dust shining in the silver sun. My Fremen call themselves children of the moon, he thought. He put down the conch, strode along the balcony. Did that terrifying moon hold out hope of escape? He probed for meaning in the region of mystic communion. He felt weak, shaken, still gripped by the spice. At the north end of his plasmod chasm, he came in sight of the lower buildings of the government warren. Foot traffic thronged the roof walks. He thought that the people moved there like a frieze against a background of doors, walls, tile designs. The people were tiles. When he blinked, he could hold them frozen in his mind. A frieze. A moon falls and is gone. A feeling came over him that the city out there had been translated into an odd symbol for his universe. The buildings he could see had been erected on the plain where his Fremen had obliterated the Sardaukar legions. Ground once trampled by battles rang now to the rushing clamour of business. Keeping to the balcony's outer edge, Paul strode around the corner. Now his vista was a suburb where city structures lost themselves in rocks and the blowing sand of the desert. Alia's temple dominated the foreground. Green and black hangings along its 2,000-metre sides displayed the moon symbol of Muad'Dib, a falling moon. Paul passed a hand across his forehead and eyes. The simple metropolis oppressed him. He despised his own thoughts. Such vacillation in another would have aroused his anger. He loathed his city. Rage rooted in boredom flickered and simmered deep within him, nurtured by decisions that couldn't be avoided. He knew which path his feet must follow. He'd seen it enough times, hadn't he? Seen it. Once, long ago, he'd thought of himself as an inventor of government, but the invention had fallen into old patterns. It was like some hideous contrivance with plastic memory, shape it any way you wanted, but relaxed for a moment, and it snapped into the ancient forms. Forces at work beyond his reach in human breast eluded and defied him. Paul stared out across the rooftops. What treasures of untrammeled life lay beneath those roofs? He glimpsed leaf-green places, open plantings amidst the chalk red and gold of the roofs, green the gift of Muad'Dib and his water. Orchards and groves lay within his view, open plantings to rival those of fabled Lebanon. Muad'Dib spends water like a madman, Fremen said. Paul put his hands over his eyes. The moon fell. He dropped his hands, stared at his metropolis with clarified vision. Buildings took on an aura of monstrous imperial barbarity. They stood enormous and bright beneath the northern sun. Colossi, every extravagance of architecture a demented history could produce lay within his view. Terraces of mesa proportion, squares as large as some cities, parks, premises, bits of cultured wilderness. Superb artistry abutted inexplicable prodigies of dismal tastelessness. Details impressed themselves upon him. A postern out of most ancient Baghdad, a dome dreamed in mythical Damascus, an arc from the low gravity of Attar, harmonious elevations and queer depths, all created an effect of unrivaled magnificence. A moon. Frustration tangled him. He felt the pressure of mass unconscious, that burgeoning sweep of humankind across his universe. They rushed upon him with a force like a gigantic tidal bore. He sensed the vast migrations at work in human affairs. Eddies, currents, gene flows, no dams of abstinence, no seizures of impotence, nor maledictions could stop it. Muad'Dib's jihad was less than an eye blink in his larger movement. The Bene Gesserit swimming in this tide, that corporate entity trading in genes, was trapped in the torrent as he was. Visions of a falling moon must be measured against other legends, other visions in a universe where even the seemingly eternal stars waned, flickered, died. What mattered a single moon in such a universe? Far within his fortress citadel, so deep within that the sound sometimes lost itself in the flow of city noises, a 10-string rebarber tinkled with a song of the jihad, a lament for a woman left behind on Arrakis. Her hips are dunes curved by the wind, her eyes shine like summer heat, 2 braids of hair hang down her back, rich with water rings her hair, my hands remembered her skin, fragrant as amber, flower-scented, eyelids tremble with memories, I am stricken by love's white flame. The song sickened him, a tune for stupid creatures lost in sentimentality, as well sing to the Dune-impregnated corpse Alia had seen. A figure moved in shadows of the balcony's grillwork. Paul whirled. The Gola emerged into the sun's full glare. His metal eyes glittered. "Is it Duncan Idaho or the man called Haight?" Paul asked. The Gola came to a stop 2 paces from him. "Which would my lord prefer?" The voice carried a soft ring of caution. "Play the Zen-Sunni," Paul said bitterly. "Meanings within meanings. What could a Zen-Sunni philosopher say or do to change one jot of the reality unrolling before them at this instant? My lord is troubled." Paul turned away, stared at the shield wall's distant scarp, and he saw wind-carved arches and buttresses, terrible mimicry of his city, nature playing a joke on him. "See what I can build." He recognized a slash in the distant massif, a place where sand spilled from a crevasse, and thought, "There, right there, we fought Sardaukar." "What troubles my lord?" the Gola asked. "A vision," Paul whispered. "Ah, when the Tleilaxu first awakened me, I had visions. I was restless, lonely, not really knowing I was lonely. Not then. My visions revealed nothing. The Tleilaxu told me it was an intrusion of the flesh which men and Golas all suffer, a sickness, no more." Paul turned, studied the Gola's eyes, those pitted, steely balls without expression. What visions did those eyes see? "Duncan, Duncan," Paul whispered. "I am called Haight. I saw a moon fall," Paul said. "It was gone, destroyed. I heard a great hissing. The earth shook." "You are drunk on too much time," the Gola said. "I ask for the Zen-Sunni and get the Mentat," Paul said. "Very well. Play my vision for your logic, Mentat. Analyze it and reduce it to mere words laid out for burial." "Burial indeed," the Gola said. "You run from death. You strain at the next instant, refuse to live here and now." "Augury. What a crutch for an emperor." Paul found himself fascinated by a well-remembered mole on the Gola's chin. "Trying to live in this future," the Gola said. "Do you give substance to such a future? Do you make it real?" "If I go the way of my visioned future, I'll be alive then," Paul muttered. What makes you think I want to live there? The Gola shrugged. You asked me for a substantial answer. Where is there substance in a universe composed of events? Paul asked. Is there a final answer? Doesn't each solution produce new questions? You've digested so much time you have delusions of immortality, the Gola said. Even your empire, my lord, must live its time and die. Don't parade smoke-blackened altars before me, Paul growled. I've heard enough sad histories of gods and messiahs. Why should I need special powers to forecast ruins of my own like all those others? The lowliest servant of my kitchens could do this. He shook his head. The moon fell. You've not brought your mind to rest at its beginning, the Gola said. Is that how you destroy me? Paul demanded. Prevent me from collecting my thoughts? Can you collect chaos? The Gola asked. We Zensuni say, not collecting, that is the ultimate gathering. What can you gather without gathering yourself? I'm devilled by a vision and you spew nonsense, Paul raged. What do you know of prescience? I've seen the oracle at work, the Gola said. I've seen those who seek signs and omens for their individual destiny. They fear what they seek. My falling moon is real, Paul whispered. He took a trembling breath. It moves. It moves. Men always fear things which move by themselves, the Gola said. You fear your own powers. Things fall into your head from nowhere. When they fall out, where do they go? You comfort me with thorns, Paul growled. An inner illumination came over the Gola's face. For a moment he became pure Duncan Idaho. I give you what comfort I can, he said. Paul wondered at the momentary spasm. Had the Gola felt grief which his mind rejected? Had hate put down a vision of his own? My moon has a name, Paul whispered. He let the vision flow over him then. Though his whole being shrieked, no sound escaped him. He was afraid to speak, fearful that his voice might betray him. The air of this terrifying future was thick of Chani's absence, flesh that had cried in ecstasy, eyes that had burned him with their desire, the voice that had charmed him because it played no tricks of subtle control. All gone, back into the water and the sand. Slowly Paul turned away, looked out at the present, and the plaza before Alia's temple. 3 shaven-headed pilgrims entered from the processional avenue. They wore grimy yellow robes and hurried with their heads bent against the afternoon's wind. One walked with a limp, dragging his left foot. They beat their way against the wind, rounded the corner, and were gone from his sight. Just as his moon would go, they were gone. Still his vision lay before him. Its terrible purpose gave him no choice. The flesh surrenders itself, he thought. Eternity takes back its own. Our body stirred at these waters briefly, danced with a certain intoxication before the love of life and self, dealt with a few strange ideas, then submitted to the instruments of time. What can we say of this? I occurred. I am not, yet I occurred. You do not beg the sun for mercy. Muad'Dib's travail, from the Stilgar commentary. One moment of incompetence can be fatal, the Reverend Mother, Gaius Telemaheim, reminded herself. She hobbled along, apparently unconcerned, within a ring of Fremen guards. One of those behind her, she knew, was a deaf mute immune to any wiles of voice. No doubt he'd been charged to kill her at the slightest provocation. Why had Paul summoned her, she wondered. Was he about to pass sentence? She remembered the day long ago when she tested him, the child Kwisatz Haderach. He was a deep one. Damn his mother for all eternity. It was her fault the Bene Gesserit had lost their hold on this gene line. Silence surged along the vaulted passages ahead of her entourage. She sensed the word being passed. Paul would hear the silence. He'd know of her coming before it was announced. She didn't delude herself with ideas that her powers exceeded his. Damn him. She begrudged the burdens age had imposed on her. The aching joints, responses not as quick as once they'd been, muscles not as elastic as the whipcords of her youth. A long day lay behind her and a long life. She spent this day with the Dune tarot in a fruitless search for some clue to her own fate, but the cards were sluggish. The guards herded her around a corner into another of the seemingly endless vaulted passages. Triangular meta-glass windows on her left gave a view upward to trellised vines and indigo flowers and deep shadows cast by the afternoon sun. Tiles lay underfoot, figures of water creatures from exotic planets, water reminders everywhere, wealth, riches. Robed figures passed across another hall in front of her, cast covert glances at the Reverend Mother. Recognition was obvious in their manner, and tension. She kept her attention on the sharp hairline of the guard immediately in front, young flesh, pink creases at the uniform collar. The immensity of this Aegir citadel began to impress her. Passages, they passed an open doorway from which emerged the sound of timbre and flute playing soft elder music. A glance showed her blue and blue Fremen eyes staring from the room. She sensed in them the ferment of legendary revolt stirring in wild genes. There lay the measure of her personal burden, she knew. A Bene Gesserit could not escape awareness of the genes and their possibilities. She was touched by a feeling of loss, that stubborn fool of an Atreides. How could he deny the jewels of posterity without his loins? A Kwisatz Haderach, born out of his time, true, but real, as his abomination of a sister. And there lay a dangerous unknown, A wild Reverend Mother spawned without Bene Gesserit inhibitions, holding no loyalty to orderly development of the genes. She shared her brother's powers, no doubt, and more. The size of the citadel began to oppress her. Would the passages never end? The place reeked of terrifying physical power. No planet, no civilization in all human history had ever before seen such man-made immensity. A dozen ancient cities could be hidden in its walls. They passed oval doors with winking lights. She recognized them for Ixian handiwork. Pneumatic transport orifices. Why was she being marched all this distance then? The answer began to shape itself in her mind, to oppress her in preparation for this audience in the Emperor. A small clue, but it joined with other subtle indications. The relative suppression and selection of words by her escort, for traces of primitive shyness in their eyes when they called her Reverend Mother. The cold and bland, essentially odourless nature of these halls all combined to reveal much that a Bene Gesserit could interpret. Paul wanted something from her. She concealed a feeling of elation. A bargaining lever existed. It remained only to find the nature of that lever and test its strength. Some levers had moved things greater than this citadel. A finger's touch had been known to topple civilizations. The Reverend Mother reminded herself then of Scythel's assessment. When a creature has developed into one thing, he will choose death rather than change into his opposite. The passages through which she was being escorted grew larger by subtle stages, tricks of arcing, graduated amplification of pillared supports, displacement of the triangular windows by larger oblong shapes. Ahead of her, finally, loomed double doors centered in the far wall of a tall antechamber. She sensed that the doors were very large, and was forced to suppress a gasp as her trained awareness measured out the true proportions. The doorway stood at least 80 meters high, half that in width. As she approached with her escort, the door swung inward. An immense and silent movement of hidden machinery. She recognized more Ixian handiwork. Through that towering doorway she marched with her guards into the grand reception hall of the Emperor Paul Atreides, Muad'Dib before whom all people are dwarfed. Now she saw the effect of that popular saying at work. As she advanced toward Paul and the distant throne, the Reverend Mother found herself more impressed by the architectural subtleties of her surroundings than she was by the immensities. The space was large. It could have housed the entire citadel of any ruler in human history. The open sweep of the room said much about hidden structural forces balanced with nicety. Trusses and supporting beams behind these walls and the faraway domed ceiling must surpass anything ever before attempted. Everything spoke of engineering genius. Without seeming to do so, the hall grew smaller at its far end, refusing to dwarf Paul on his throne centered on a dais. An untrained awareness, shocked by surrounding proportions, would see him at first as many times larger than his actual size. Colours played upon the unprotected psyche. Paul's green throne had been cut from a single Hagar emerald. It suggested growing things, and out of the Fremen mythos reflected the mourning colour. It whispered that here sat he who could make you mourn. Life and death in one symbol, a clever stress of opposites. Behind the throne, draperies cascaded in burnt orange, curried gold of Dune earth, and cinnamon flecks of melange. To a trained eye, the symbolism was obvious, but it contained hammer blows to beat down the uninitiated. Time played its role here. The Reverend Mother measured the minutes required to approach the Imperial presence at her hobbling pace. You had time to be cowed. Any tendency toward resentment would be squeezed out of you by the unbridled power which focused down upon your person. You might start the long march toward that throne as a human of dignity, but you ended the march as a gnat. Aides and attendants stood around the Emperor in a curiously ordered sequence, attentive household guardsmen along the draped back wall, that abomination Alia 2 steps below Paul, and on his left hand Stilgar, the Imperial lackey, on the step directly below Alia, and on the right, one step up from the floor, off the hall, a solitary figure, the fleshy revenant of Duncan, Idaho, the Gola. She marked older Fremen among the guardsmen, bearded naibs with stillsuit scars on their noses, sheathed crysknives at their waists, a few Marla pistols, even some lasguns. Those must be trusted men, she thought, to carry lasguns in Paul's presence when he obviously wore a shield generator. She could see the shimmering of its field around him. One burst of a lasgun into that field and the entire citadel would be a hole in the ground. Her guard stopped 10 paces from the foot of the dais, parted to open an unobstructed view of the Emperor. She noted now the absence of Chani and Dirulan, wondered at it. He held no important audience about them, so it was said. Paul nodded to her, silent, measuring. Immediately she decided to take the offensive, said, "So, the great Paul Atreides designs to see the one he banished." Paul smiled wryly, thinking, she knows I want something from her. That knowledge had been inevitable, she being who she was. He recognized her powers. The Bene Gesserit didn't become Reverend Mothers by chance. Shall we dispense with fencing? He asked. Would it be this easy? She wondered. And she said, Name the thing you want. Stilgar stirred, cast a sharp glance at Paul. The Imperial lackey didn't like her tone. Stilgar wants me to send you away, Paul said. Not kill me? She asked. I would have expected something more direct from a Fremen naib. Stilgar scowled, said, Often I must speak otherwise than I think. That is called diplomacy. And let us dispense with diplomacy as well, she said. Was it necessary to have me walk all that distance? I am an old woman. You have to be shown how callous I can be, Paul said. That way you'll appreciate magnanimity. You dare such gaucheries of a Bene Gesserit? She asked. Gross actions carry their own messages, Paul said. She hesitated, weighed his words. So, he might yet dispense with her. Grossly, obviously, if she what? Say what it is you want from me, she muttered. Alia glanced at her brother, nodded toward the draperies behind the throne. She knew Paul's reasoning in this, but disliked it all the same. Call it wild prophecy. She felt pregnant with reluctance to take part in this bargaining. You must be careful how you speak to me, old woman, Paul said. He called me old woman when he was a stripling, the Reverend Mother thought. Does he remind me now of my hand in his past? The decision I made then? Must I remake it here? She felt the weight of decision, a physical thing that set her knees to trembling. Muscles cried their fatigue. It was a long walk, Paul said, and I can see that you are tired. We will retire to my private chamber behind the throne. You may sit there. He gave a hand signal to Stilgar, arose. Stilgar and the Gola converged on her, helped her up the steps, followed Paul through a passage concealed by the draperies. She realized then why he had greeted her in the hall, a dumb show for the guards and naibs. He feared them then. And now, he displayed kindly benevolence, staring such wiles on a Bene Gesserit. Or was it daring? She sensed another presence behind, glanced back to see Alia following. The young woman's eyes held a brooding, baleful cast. The Reverend Mother shuddered. The private chamber at the end of the passage was a 20-meter cube of plasmeld, yellow glow globes for light, the deep orange hangings of a desert steel tent around the walls. It contained divans, soft cushions, a faint odour of melange, crystal water flagons on a low table, and felt cramped tiny after the outer hall. Paul seated her on the divan, stood over her, studying the ancient face, steely teeth, eyes that hid more than they revealed, deeply wrinkled skin. He indicated the water flagon. She shook her head, dislodging a wisp of grey hair. In a low voice, Paul said, I wish to bargain with you for the life of my beloved. Stilgar cleared his throat. Alia fingered the handle of the crucifix sheathed at her neck. The Gola remained at the door, face impassive, metal eyes pointed at the air above the Reverend Mother's head. Have you had a vision of my hand in her death? The Reverend Mother asked. She kept her attention on the Gola, oddly disturbed by him. Why should she feel threatened by the Gola? He was a tool of the conspiracy. I know what it is you want from me, Paul said, avoiding her question. Then he only suspects, she thought. The Reverend Mother looked down at the tips of her shoes exposed by a fold of her robe. Black. Shoes and robe showed marks of her confinement. Stains, wrinkles. She lifted her chin, met an angry glare in Paul's eyes. Elation surged through her, but she hid the emotion behind pursed lips, slitted eyelids. What coin do you offer? She asked. You may have my seed, but not my person, Paul said. Irulan banished and inseminated by artificial. You dare! The Reverend Mother flared, stiffening. Stilgar took a half-step forward. Disconcertingly, the Gola smiled, and now Alia was studying him. We'll not discuss the things your sisterhood forbids, Paul said. I will listen to no talk of sins, abominations, or the beliefs left from past jihads. You may have my seed for your plans, but no child of Irulan's will sit on my throne. Your throne, she sneered. My throne. Then who will bear the imperial heir? Chani. She is barren. She is with child. An involuntary indrawn breath exposed her shock. You lie, she snapped. Paul held up a restraining hand as Stilgar surged forward. We've known for 2 days that she carries my child, but Irulan, by artificial means only, that's my offer. The Reverend Mother closed her eyes to hide his face. Damnation! To cast the genetic dice in such a way. Loathing boiled in her breast. The teaching of the Bene Gesserit, the lessons of the Butlerian Jihad, all prescribed such an act. One did not demean the highest aspirations of humankind. No machine could function in the way of a human mind. No word or deed could imply that men might be bred on the level of animals. Your decision, Paul said. She shook her head. The genes, the precious Atreides genes, only these were important. Need went deeper than proscription. For the sisterhood, mating mingled more than sperm and ovum. one aimed to capture the psyche. The Reverend Mother understood now the subtle depths of Paul's offer. He would make the Bene Gesserit party to an act which would bring down popular wrath, were it ever discovered. They could not admit such paternity if the Emperor denied it. This coin might save the Atreides genes for the sisterhood, but it would never buy a throne. She swept her gaze around the room, studying each face. Stilgar, passive and waiting now, the Gola frozen at some inward place, Alia watching the Gola, and Paul, wrath beneath a shallow veneer. "This is your only offer?" she asked. "My only offer." She glanced at the Gola, caught by a brief movement of muscles across his cheeks. "Emotion? You, Gola," she said. "Should such an offer be made? Having been made, should it be accepted? Function as the mentat for us." The metallic eyes turned to Paul. "Answer as you will," Paul said. The Gola returned his gleaming attention to the Reverend Mother, shocked her once more by smiling. "An offer is only as good as the real thing it buys," he said. "The exchange offered here is life for life, a high order of business." Alia brushed a strand of coppery hair from her forehead, said, "And what else is hidden in this bargain?" The Reverend Mother refused to look at Alia, but the words burned in her mind. Yes, far deeper implications lay here. The sister was an abomination, true, but there could be no denying her status as a Reverend Mother if all the title implied. Gaius Helen Mahaim felt herself in this instant to be not one single person, but all the others who sat like tiny congeries in her memory. They were alert, every Reverend Mother she had absorbed in becoming a priestess of the sisterhood. Alia would be standing in the same situation here. "What else?" the Gola asked. "One wonders why the witches of the Bene Gesserit have not used Tleilaxu methods." Gaius Helen Mahaim and all the Reverend Mothers within her shuddered. Yes, for Tleilaxu did loathsome things. If one let down the barriers to artificial insemination, was the next step of Tleilaxu one? Controlled mutation? Paul, observing the play of emotion around him, felt abruptly that he no longer knew these people. He could see only strangers. Even Alia was a stranger. Alia said, "If we set the Atreides genes adrift in a Bene Gesserit river, who knows what may result?" Gaius Helen Mahaim's head snapped around and she met Alia's gaze. For a flashing instant they were two Reverend Mothers together, communing on a single thought. What lay behind any Tleilaxu action? The Gola was a Tleilaxu thing. Had he put this plan into Paul's mind? Would Paul attempt to bargain directly with the Bene Tleilax? She broke her gaze from Alia's, feeling her own ambivalence and inadequacies. The pitfall of Bene Gesserit training, she reminded herself, lay in the powers granted. Such powers predisposed one to vanity and pride, but power deluded those who used it. One tended to believe power could overcome any barrier, including one's own ignorance. Only one thing stood paramount here for the Bene Gesserit, she told herself. There was the pyramid of generations which had reached an apex in Paul Atreides, and in his abomination of a sister. A wrong choice here and the pyramid would have to be rebuilt, starting generations back in the parallel lines with breeding specimens lacking the choicest characteristics. Controlled mutation, she thought. Did the Tleilaxu really practice it? How tempting. She shook her head, the better to rid it of such thoughts. "You reject my proposal?" Paul asked. "I'm thinking," she said, and again she looked at the sister. The optimum cross for this female Atreides had been lost, killed by Paul. Another possible ability remained, however, one which would cement the desired characteristic into an offspring. Paul dared offer animal breeding to the Bene Gesserit. How much was he really prepared to pay for this Chani's life? Would he accept a cross with his own sister? Sparring for time, the Reverend Mother said, "Tell me, O flawless exemplar of all that's holy, has Irulan anything to say of your proposal?" "Irulan will do what you tell her to do," Paul growled. True enough, Mahaim thought. She firmed her jaw, offered a new gambit. "There are two Atreides." Paul, sensing something of what lay in the old witch's mind, felt blood darken his face. "Careful what you suggest," he said. "You just use Irulan to gain your own ends, eh?" she asked. "Wasn't she trained to be used?" Paul asked. "And we trained her. That's what he's saying," Mahaim thought. "Well, Irulan's a divided coin. Was there another way to spend such a coin?" "Will you put Chani's child on the throne?" the Reverend Mother asked. "On my throne," Paul said. He glanced at Alia, wondering suddenly if she knew the divergent possibilities in this exchange. Alia stood with eyes closed, an odd stillness of person about her. With what inner force did she commune? Seeing his sister thus, Paul felt he'd been cast adrift. Alia stood on a shore that was receding from him. The Reverend Mother made her decision, said, "This is too much for one person to decide. I must consult with my council on Wallach. Will you permit a message?" As though she needed my permission, Paul thought. He said, "Agreed then, but don't delay too long. I will not sit idly by while you debate." "Will you bargain with the Bene Tleilax?" the Gola asked, his voice a sharp intrusion. Alia's eyes popped open and she stared at the Gola as though she'd been wakened by a dangerous intruder. "I've made no such decision," Paul said. "What I will do is go into the desert as soon as it can be arranged. Our child will be born in Sietch." "A wise decision," Stilgar intoned. Alia refused to look at Stilgar. It was a wrong decision. She could feel this in every cell. Paul must know it. Why had he fixed himself upon such a path? Have the B'nai Tleilax offered their services? Alia asked. She saw Mahayim hanging on the answer. Paul shook his head. No. He glanced at Stilgar. Still, arrange for the message to be sent to Warlock. At once, my lord. Paul turned away, waited while Stilgar summoned guards, left with the old witch. He sensed Alia debating whether to confront him with more questions. She turned instead to the Gola. Mentat, she said. Will the Tleilaxu bid for favour with my brother? The Gola shrugged. Paul felt his attention wander. But Tleilaxu? No, not in the way Alia meant. Her question revealed, though, that she had not seen the alternatives here. Well, vision varied from Sibyl to Sibyl. Why not a variance from brother to sister? Wandering. He came back from each fort with a start to pick up shards of the nearby conversation. Must know what the Tleilaxu, the fullness of data is always. Healthy doubts where. Paul turned, looked at his sister, caught her attention. He knew she would see tears on his face and wonder at them. Let her wonder. Wondering was a kindness now. He glanced at the Gola, seeing only Duncan Idaho despite the metallic eyes. Sorrow and compassion warred in Paul. What might those metal eyes record? There are many degrees of sight and many degrees of blindness, Paul thought. His mind turned to a paraphrase of the passage from the Orange Catholic Bible. What senses do we lack that we cannot see another world all around us? Were those metal eyes another sense than sight? Alia crossed to her brother, sensing his utter sadness. She touched a tear on his cheek with a feminine gesture of awe, said, We must not grieve for those dear to us before their passing. Before their passing, Paul whispered. Tell me, little sister, what is before? I've had a belly full of the god and priest business. You think I don't see my own mythos? Consult your data once more, Hayat. I've insinuated my rights into the most elementary human acts. The people eat in the name of Muad'Dib. They make love in my name, are born in my name, cross the street in my name. A roof beam cannot be raised in the lowest hovel of far Gangeshri without invoking the blessing of Muad'Dib. Book of Diatribes from the Hayat Chronicle. You risk much leaving your post and coming to me here at this time, Edric said, glaring through the walls of his tank at the face dancer. How weak and narrow is your thinking, Sightale said. Who is it who comes to visit you? Edric hesitated, observing the hulk shape, heavy eyelids, blunt face. It was early in the day and Edric's metabolism had not yet cycled from night repose into full melange consumption. This is not the shape which walked the streets? Edric asked. One would not look twice at some of the figures I have been today, Sightale said. The chameleon thinks a change of shape will hide him from anything. Edric thought with rare insight, and he wondered if his presence in the conspiracy truly hid them from all oracular powers. The Emperor's sister, now. Edric shook his head, stirring the orange gas of his tank, said, Why are you here? The gift must be prodded to swifter action, Sightale said. That cannot be done. A way must be found, Sightale insisted. Why? Things are not to my liking. The Emperor is trying to split us. Already he has made his bid to the Bene Gesserit. Oh, that! That! You must prod the Gola to... You fashioned him, Tleilaxu, Edric said. You know better than to ask this. He paused, moved closer to the transparent wall of his tank. Or did you lie to us about this gift? Lie? You said the weapon was to be aimed and released. Nothing more. Once the Gola was given, we could not tamper. Any Gola can be disturbed, Sightale said. You need do nothing more than question him about his original being. What will this do? It will stir him to actions which will serve our purpose. He is a mentat with powers of logic and reason, Edric objected. He may guess what I'm doing, or the sister. If her attention is focused upon, do you hide us from the Sibyl or don't you? Sightale asked. I'm not afraid of oracles, Edric said. I'm concerned with logic, with real spies, with the physical powers of the Imperium, with the control of the spice, with... One can contemplate the Emperor and his powers comfortably if one remembers that all things are finite, Sightale said. Oddly, the steersman recoiled in agitation, threshing his limbs like some weird newt. Sightale fought a sense of loathing at the sight. The guild navigator wore his usual dark leotard bulging at the belt of various containers, yet he gave the impression of nakedness when he moved. It was the swimming, reaching movements, Sightale decided, and he was struck once more by the delicate linkages of their conspiracy. They were not a compatible group. That was weakness. Edric's agitation subsided. He stared out at Sightale, vision coloured by the orange gas which sustained him. What plot did the face dancer hold in reserve to save himself? Edric wondered. The Tleilaxu was not acting in a predictable fashion. Evil omen. Something in the navigator's voice and actions told Sightale that the guildsmen feared the sister more than the Emperor. This was an abrupt, Thought flashed on the screen of awareness. Disturbing. Had they overlooked something important about Alia? Would the Gola be sufficient weapon to destroy both? You know what is said of Alia? Scytale asked, probing. What do you mean? Again the fishman was agitated. Never have philosophy and culture had such a patroness, Scytale said. Pleasure and beauty unite in... What is enduring about beauty and pleasure? Edric demanded. We will destroy both Atreides. Culture. They dispense culture the better to rule. Beauty. They promote the beauty which enslaves. They create a literate ignorance, easiest thing of all. They leave nothing to chance. Chains. Everything they do forges chains, enslaves, but slaves always revolt. The sister may wed and produce an offspring, Scytale said. Why do you speak of the sister? Edric asked. The Emperor may choose a mate for her, Scytale said. Let him choose. Already it is too late. Even you cannot invent the next moment, Scytale warned. You are not a creator, any more than are the Atreides. He nodded. We must not presume too much. We aren't the ones to flap our tongues about creation, Edric protested. We aren't the rabble trying to make a messiah out of Muad'Dib. What is this nonsense? Why are you raising such questions? It's this planet, Scytale said. It raises questions. Planets don't speak. This one does. Oh, it speaks of creation. Sand blowing in the night. That is creation. Sand blowing. When you awaken, the first light shows you the new world. All fresh and ready for your tracks. Untracked sand? Edric thought. Creation? He felt knotted with sudden anxiety. The confinement of his tank, the surrounding room, everything closed in upon him, constricted him. Tracks in sand. You talk like a Fremen, Edric said. This is a Fremen fort, and it's instructive, Scytale agreed. They speak of Muad'Dib's jihad as leaving tracks in the universe in the same way that a Fremen tracks new sand. They've marked out a trail in men's lives. So, another night comes, Scytale said. Winds blow. Yes, Edric said. The jihad is finite. Muad'Dib has used his jihad, and he didn't use the jihad, Scytale said. The jihad used him. I think he would have stopped it if he could. If he could. All he had to do was... Oh, be still, Scytale barked. You can't stop a mentat epidemic. It leaps from person to person across parsecs. It's overwhelmingly contagious. It strikes at the unprotected side, in the place where we lodge the fragments of other such plagues. Who can stop such a thing? Muad'Dib hasn't the antidote. The thing has roots in chaos. Can orders reach there? Have you been infected, then? Edric asked. He turned slowly in the orange gas, wondering why Scytale's words carried such a tone of fear. Had the phased dancer broken from the conspiracy? There was no way to peer into the future and examine this now. The future had become a muddy stream, clogged with prophets. We're all contaminated, Scytale said, and he reminded himself that Edric's intelligence had severe limits. How could this point be made that the guildsman would understand it? But when we destroy him, Edric said, the contage... I should leave you in this ignorance, Scytale said, but my duties will not permit it. Besides, it's dangerous to all of us. Edric recoiled, steadied himself with a kick of one webbed foot, which sent the orange gas whipping around his legs. You speak strangely, he said. This whole thing is explosive, Scytale said in a calmer voice. It's ready to shatter. When it goes, it will send bits of itself out through the centuries. Don't you see this? We've talked of religions before, Edric protested. If this new... It is not just a religion, Scytale said, wondering what the Reverend Mother would say to this harsh education of their fellow conspirator. Religious government is something else. Muad'Dib has crowded his Khizar-8 in everywhere, displaced the old functions of government, but he has no permanent civil service, no interlocking embassies. He has bishoprics, islands of authority. At the center of each island is a man. Men learn how to gain and hold personal power. Men are jealous. When they're divided, we'll absorb them one by one. Edric said with a complacent smile. Cut off the head and the body will fall too. This body has two heads, Scytale said. The sister, who may wed, who will certainly wed. I don't like your tone, Scytale, and I don't like your ignorance. What if she does wed? Will that shake our plans? It will shake the universe, but they're not unique. I myself possess powers which you're an infant. You toddle where they stride. They are not unique. You forget, guildsman, that we once made a Kwisatz Haderach. This is a being filled by the spectacle of time. It is a form of existence which cannot be threatened without enclosing yourself in the identical threat. Muad'Dib knows you would attack his Chani. We must move faster than we have. You must get the Gola, prod him as I have instructed. And if I do not, we will feel the thunderbolt. O worm of many teeth, canst thou deny what has no cure? The flesh and breath which lure thee to the ground of all beginnings, feed on monsters twisting in a door of fire. Thou hast no robe in all thy attire to cover intoxications of divinity or hide the burnings of desire. Worm Song, from the Dune book. Paul had worked up a sweat on the practice floor using Chris knife and short sword against the Gola. He stood now at a window looking down into the temple plaza, tried to imagine the scene with Chani at the clinic. She'd been taken ill at mid-morning, the 6th week of her pregnancy. The medics were the best. They'd call when they heard news. Murky afternoon sand clouds darkened the sky over the plaza. Fremen called such weather dirty air. Would the medics never call? Each second struggled past, reluctant to enter his universe. Waiting. The Bene Gesserit sent no word from Wylak, deliberately delaying, of course. Prescient Vision had recorded these moments, but he shielded his awareness from the Oracle, preferring the role here of a time fish swimming not where he willed, but where the currents carried him. Destiny permitted no struggles now. The Gola could be heard racking weapons, examining the equipment. Paul sighed, put a hand to his own belt, deactivated his shield. The tingling passage of its field ran down against his skin. He'd face events when Chani came, Paul told himself, time enough then to accept the fact that what he'd concealed from her had prolonged her life. Was it evil, he wondered, to prefer Chani to an heir? By what right did he make her choice for her? Foolish thoughts. Who could hesitate, given the alternatives? Slave pits, torture, agonizing sorrow, and worse. He heard the door open, Chani's footsteps. Paul turned. Murder sat on Chani's face. The wide Fremen belt which gathered the waist of her golden robe, the water rings worn as a necklace, one hand at her hip, never far from the knife, the trenchant stare which was her first inspection of any room. Everything about her stood now only as a background for violence. He opened his arms as she came to him, gathered her close. Someone, she gasped, speaking against his breast, has been feeding me a contraceptive for a long time, before I began the new diet. There'll be problems with this birth because of it. But there are remedies? He asked. Dangerous remedies. I know the source of that poison. I'll have her blood. My Sahaya, he whispered, holding her close to calm a sudden trembling. You'll bear the air we want. Isn't that enough? My life burns faster, she said, pressing against him. The birth now controls my life. The medics told me it goes at a terrible pace. I must eat, and take more spice as well. Eat it, drink it. I'll kill her for this. Paul kissed her cheek. No, my Sahaya, you'll kill no one. And he thought, Irulan belonged to your life, beloved. For you, the time of birth is the time of death. He thought hidden grief drained his marrow then, empty his life into a black flask. Chani pushed away from him. She cannot be forgiven. Who said anything about forgiving? Then why shouldn't I kill her? It was such a flat, Fremen question that Paul felt himself almost overcome by a hysterical desire to laugh. He covered it by saying, it wouldn't help. You've seen that? Paul felt his belly tighten with vision memory. What I've seen, he muttered. Every aspect of surrounding events fitted the present, which paralysed him. He felt chained to a future which, exposed too often, had locked onto him like a greedy succubus. Tight dryness clogged his throat. Had he followed the witch call of his own oracle, he wondered, until it spilled him into a merciless present? Tell me what you've seen, Chani said. I can't. Why mustn't I kill her? Because I ask it. He watched her accept this. She did it the way sand accepted water, absorbing and concealing. Was there obedience beneath that hot, angry surface, he wondered? And he realized then that life in the Royal Keep had left Chani unchanged. She'd merely stopped here for a time, inhabited a way station on a journey with her man. Nothing of the desert had been taken from her. Chani stepped away from him then, glanced at the Gola who stood waiting near the diamond circle of the practice floor. You've been crossing blades with him? She asked. And I'm better for it. Her gaze went to the circle on the floor, back to the Gola's metallic eyes. I don't like it, she said. He's not intended to do me violence, Paul said. You've seen that? I've not seen it. Then how do you know? Because he's more than a Gola. He's Duncan Idaho. The B'nai Tleilaxu made him. They made more than they intended. She shook her head. A corner of her Nezhoni scarf rubbed the collar of her robe. How can he change the fact that he is Gola? Hate, Paul said. Are you the tool of my undoing? If the substance of here and now is changed, the future is changed, the Gola said. That is no answer, Chani objected. Paul raised his voice. How will I die, Hate? Light glinted from the artificial eyes. It is said, my lord, that you will die of money and power. Chani stiffened. How dare he speak thus to you? The mentat is truthful, Paul said. Was Duncan Idaho a real friend? She asked. He gave his life for me. It is said, Chani whispered, that a Gola cannot be restored to his original being. Would you convert me? The Gola asked, directing his gaze to Chani. What does he mean? Chani asked. To be converted is to be turned around, Paul said. But there's no going back. Every man carries his own past with him, Hayat said. And every Gola? Paul asked. In a way, my lord. Then what of that past in your secret flesh? Paul asked. Shani saw how the question disturbed the Gola. His movements quickened, hands clenched into fists. She glanced at Paul, wondering why he probed thus. Was there a way to restore this creature to the man he'd been? Has the Gola ever remembered his real past? Shani asked. Many attempts have been made, Hayat said, his gaze fixed on the floor near his feet. No Gola has ever been restored to his former being. But you long for this to happen, Paul said. The blank surfaces of the Gola's eyes came up to center on Paul with a pressing intensity. Yes. Voice soft, Paul said, if there's a way, this flesh, Hayat said, touching left hand to forehead in a curious eluting movement, is not the flesh of my original birth. It is reborn. Only the shape is familiar. A face dancer might do as well. Not as well, Paul said, and you're not a face dancer. That is true, my lord. Whence comes your shape? The genetic imprint of the original cells. Somewhere, Paul said, there's a plastic something which remembers the shape of Duncan, Idaho. It said the ancients probed this region before the Butlerian Jihad. What's the extent of this memory, Hayat? What does it learn from the original? The Gola shrugged. What if he wasn't Idaho? Chani asked. He was. Can you be certain? She asked. He is Duncan in every aspect. I can't imagine a force strong enough to hold that shape, thus without any relaxation or any deviation. My lord, Hayat objected, because we cannot imagine a thing, but doesn't exclude it from reality. There are things I must do as a Gola that I would not do as a man. Keeping his attention on Chani, Paul said, You see? She nodded. Paul turned away, fighting deep sadness. He crossed to the balcony windows, drew the draperies. Lights came on in the sudden gloom. He pulled the sash of his robe tight, listened for sound behind him. Nothing. He turned. Chani stood as though entranced, her gaze centered on the Gola. Hayat, Paul saw, had retreated to some inner chamber of his being, had gone back to the Gola place. Chani turned at the sound of Paul's return. She still felt the thraldom of the instant Paul had precipitated. For a brief moment the Gola had been an intense, vital human being. For that moment he had been someone she did not fear. Indeed, someone she liked and admired. Now she understood Paul's purpose in this probing. He had wanted her to see the man in the Gola flesh. She stared at Paul. That man was that Duncan Idaho? That was Duncan Idaho. He is still there. Would he have allowed Irulan to go on living? Charlie asked. The water didn't sink too deep, Paul thought, and he said, If I commanded it. I don't understand, she said. Shouldn't you be angry? I am angry. You don't sound angry. You sound sorrowful. He closed his eyes. Yes, that too. You're my man, she said. I know this, but suddenly I don't understand you. Abruptly, Paul felt he walked down the long cavern. His flesh moved, one foot and then another, but his thoughts went everywhere. I don't understand myself, he whispered. When he opened his eyes, he found that he had moved away from Chani. She spoke from somewhere behind him. Beloved, I'll not ask again what you've seen. I only know I am to give you the air we want. He nodded. Then, I've known that from the beginning. He turned, studied her. Chani seemed very far away. She drew herself up, placed a hand on her abdomen. I'm hungry. The medics tell me I must eat 3 or 4 times what I ate before. I'm frightened, beloved. It goes too fast. Too fast, he agreed. This fetus knows the necessity for speed. The audacious nature of Muad'Dib's actions may be seen in the fact that he knew from the beginning whither he was bound, yet not once did he step aside from that path. He put it clearly when he said, I tell you that I come now to my time of testing, when it will be shown that I am the ultimate servant. Thus he weaves all into one, that both friend and foe may worship him. It is for this reason and this reason only that his apostles prayed, Lord, save us from the other paths, which Muad'Dib covered with the waters of his life. Those other paths may be imagined only with the deepest revulsion. From the Yim el-Din, Book of Judgment. The messenger was a young woman, her face, name, and family known to Chani, which is how she'd penetrated imperial security. Chani had done no more than identify her for a security officer named Banerjee, who then arranged the meeting with Muad'Dib. Banerjee acted out of instinct and the assurance that the young woman's father had been a member of the Emperor's death commandos, the dreaded Fedaykin, in the days before the jihad. Otherwise he might have ignored her plea that her message was intended only for the ears of Muad'Dib. She was, of course, screened and searched before the meeting in Paul's private office. Even so, Banerjee accompanied her, hand on knife, other hand on her arm. It was almost midday when they brought her into the room. An odd space, mixture of desert Fremen and family aristocrat, Irag, Heerag hangings lined three walls, delicate tapestries adorned with figures out of Fremen mythology. A view screen covered the fourth wall, a silver-grey surface behind an oval desk whose top held only one object, a Fremen sand clock built into an orrery. The orrery, a suspension mechanism from Ix, carried both moons of Arrakis in the classic worm trine aligned with the sun. Paul, standing beside the desk, glanced at Banerjee. The security officer was one of those who'd come up through the Fremen constabulary, winning his place on brains and proven loyalty despite the smuggler ancestry attested by his name. He was a solid figure, almost fat. Wisps of black hair fell down over the dark, wet-appearing skin of his forehead like the crest of an exotic bird. His eyes were blue, and steady in a gaze which could look upon happiness or atrocity without change of expression. Both Chani and Stilgar trusted him. Paul knew that if he told Banerjee to throttle the girl immediately, Banerjee would do it. "Sire, here is the messenger girl," Banerjee said. "Milady Chani said she sent word to you." "Yes," Paul nodded curtly. Oddly, the girl didn't look at him. Her attention remained on the orrery. She was dark-skinned, of medium height, her figure concealed by a robe whose rich wine fabric and simple cut spoke of wealth. Her blue-black hair was held in a narrow band of material which matched the robe. The robe concealed her hands. Paul suspected that her hands were tightly clasped. It would be in character. Everything about her would be in character, including the robe, a last piece of finery saved for such a moment. Paul motioned Banerjee aside. He hesitated before obeying. Now the girl moved, one step forward. When she moved there was grace. Still her eyes avoided him. Paul cleared his throat. Now the girl lifted her gaze, the whiteless eyes widening with just the right shade of awe. She had an odd little face with delicate chin, a sense of reserve in the way she held her small mouth. The eyes appeared abnormally large above slanted cheeks. There was a cheerless air about her, something which said she seldom smiled. The corners of her eyes even held a faint yellow misting which could have been from dust irritation or the tracery of Semuta. Everything was in character. "You asked to see me," Paul said. The moment of supreme test for this girl's shape had come. Sidetail had put out on the shape, the mannerisms, the sex, the voice, everything his abilities could grasp and assume, but this was a female known to Muad'Dib in the Siege days. She'd been a child then, but she and Muad'Dib shared common experiences. Certain areas of memory must be avoided delicately. It was the most exacting part Sidetail had ever attempted. "I am Avaim's Lichna of Berk al-Dib." The girl's voice came out small but firm, giving name, father, and pedigree. Paul nodded. He saw how Chani had been fooled. The timbre of voice, everything reproduced with exactitude. Had it not been for his own Bene Gesserit training in voice and for the web of Tao in which oracular vision enfolded him, this face dancer disguise might have gulled even him. Training exposed certain discrepancies. The girl was older than her known years. Too much control tuned the vocal cords. A set of neck and shoulders missed by a fraction the subtle hauteur of Fremen poise, but there were niceties too. The rich robe had been patched to betray actual status, and the features were beautifully exact. They spoke a certain sympathy of this face dancer for the role being played. "Rest in my home, daughter of Avaim," Paul said in formal Fremen greeting. "You are welcome as water after a dry crossing." The faintest of relaxations exposed for confidence this apparent acceptance had conveyed. "I bring a message," she said. "A man's messenger is as himself," Paul said. Sidetail breathed softly. It went well, but now came the crucial task. The Atreides must be guided onto that special path. He must lose his Fremen concubine in circumstances where no other shared the blame. The failure must belong only to the omnipotent Muad'Dib. He had to be led into an ultimate realization of his failure and then to acceptance of the Tleilaxu alternative. "And the smoke which banishes sleep in the night," Sidetail said, employing a Fedakan code phrase. "I bear bad tidings." Paul fought to maintain calmness. He felt naked, his soul abandoned in a groping time concealed from every vision. Powerful oracles hid this face dancer. Only the edges of these moments were known to Paul. He knew only what he could not do. He could not slay this face dancer. That would precipitate the future which must be avoided at all cost. Somehow a way must be found to reach into the darkness and change the terrifying pattern. "Give me your message," Paul said. Banerjee moved to place himself where he could watch the girl's face. She seemed to notice him for the first time, and her gaze went to the knife handle beneath the security officer's hand. "The innocent do not believe in evil," she said, looking squarely at Banerjee. "Ah, well done," Paul thought. It was what the real Lichna would have said. He felt a momentary pang for the real daughter of Avaim, dead now, a corpse in the sand. There was no time for such emotions, though. He scowled. Banerjee kept his attention on the girl. "I was told to deliver my message in secret," she said. "Why?" Banerjee demanded, voice harsh, probing. "Because it is my father's wish. This is my friend," Paul said. "Am I not a Fremen? Then my friend may hear anything I hear." Sidetail composed the girl shape. Was this a true Fremen custom, or was it a test? The Emperor may make his own rules, Scytale said. This is the message. My father wishes you to come to him, bringing Chani. Why must I bring Chani? She is your woman and a Sayadina. This is a water matter, by the rules of our tribes. She must attest it that my father speaks according to the Fremen way. There truly are Fremen in the conspiracy. Paul thought. This moment fitted the shape of things to come for sure, and he had no alternative but to commit himself to this course. Of what will your father speak? Paul asked. He will speak of a plot against you, a plot among the Fremen. Why doesn't he bring that message in person? Banerjee demanded. She kept her gaze on Paul. My father cannot come here. The plotters suspect him. He'd not survive the journey. Could he not divulge the plot to you? Banerjee asked. How came he to risk his daughter on such a mission? The details are locked in a Distrans carrier that only Muad'Dib may open, she said. This much I know. Why not send the Distrans, then? Paul asked. It is a human Distrans, she said. I'll go then, Paul said, but I'll go alone. Chani must come with you. Chani is with child. When has a Fremen woman refused to? My enemies fed her a subtle poison, Paul said. It will be a difficult birth. Her health will not permit her to accompany me now. Before Scytale could still them, strange emotions passed over the girl features. Frustration, anger. Scytale was reminded that every victim must have a way of escape, even such a one as Muad'Dib. The conspiracy had not failed, though. The Atreides remained in the net. He was a creature who had developed firmly into one pattern. He'd destroy himself before changing into the opposite of that pattern. That had been the way with the Tleilaxu Kwisatz Haderach. It'd be the way with this one. And then, the Gola. Let me ask Chani to decide this, she said. I have decided it, Paul said. You will accompany me in Chani's stead. It requires a Sayadina of the right. Are you not Chani's friend? Boxed, Scytale thought. Does he suspect? No. He's being Fremen cautious, and the contraceptive is a fact. Well, there are other ways. My father told me I was not to return, Scytale said, that I was to seek asylum with you. He said you'd not risk me. Paul nodded. It was beautifully in character. He couldn't deny this asylum. She'd pled Fremen obedience to her father's command. I'll take Stilgar's wife, Hara, Paul said. You'll tell us the way to your father. How do you know you can trust Stilgar's wife? I know it, but I don't. Paul pursed his lips then. Does your mother live? My true mother has gone to Shai Hulud. My second mother still lives and cares for my father. Why? She's of Sietch Tabor? Yes, I remember her, Paul said. She will serve in Chani's place. He motioned to Banerjee. Have attendants take Ave and Slikna to suitable quarters. Banerjee nodded. Attendants. The key word meant that this messenger must be put under special guard. He took her arm. She resisted. How will you go to my father? She pleaded. He will describe the way to Banerjee, Paul said. He is my friend. No, my father has commanded it. I cannot. Banerjee? Paul said. Banerjee paused. Paul saw the man searching that encyclopedic memory which had helped bring him to his position of trust. I know a guide who can take you to Aveum, Banerjee said. Then I'll go alone, Paul said. Sire, if you... Aveum wants it this way, Paul said, barely concealing the irony which consumed him. Sire, it's too dangerous, Banerjee protested. Even an emperor must accept some risks, Paul said. The decision is made. Do as I've commanded. Reluctantly, Banerjee led the face dancer from the room. Paul turned toward the blank screen behind his desk. He thought that he waited for the arrival of a rock on its blind journey from some height. Should he tell Banerjee about the messenger's true nature, he wondered? No, such an incident hadn't been written on the screen of his vision. Any deviation he carried precipitate violence. A moment of fulcrum had to be found, a place where he could will himself out of the vision, if such a moment existed. No matter how exotic human civilization becomes, no matter the development of life and society, nor the complexity of the machine/human interface, there always comes interludes of lonely power when the course of humankind, the very feature of humankind, depends upon the relatively simple actions of single individuals. From the Tleilaxu God Book. As he crossed over on the high footbridge from his keep to the Kizarate office building, Paul added a limb to his walk. It was almost sunset and he walked through long shadows that helped conceal him, but sharp eyes still might detect something in his carriage that identified him. He wore a shield, but it was not activated, his aides having decided that the shimmer of it might arouse suspicions. Paul glanced left. Strings of sand clouds lay across the sunset like slatted shutters. The air was hair-egg dry through his stillsuit filters. He wasn't really alone out here, but the web of security hadn't been this loose around him since he had ceased walking the streets alone in the night. Ornithopters with night scanners drifted far overhead in seemingly random pattern, all of them tied to his movements for a transmitter concealed in his clothing. Picked men walked the streets below. Others had fanned out through the city after seeing the Emperor in his disguise, Fremen costume down to the stillsuit and Temag desert boots. The darkened features. His cheeks had been distorted with plastine inserts. A catch tube ran down along his left jaw. As he reached the opposite end of the bridge, Paul glanced back, noted a movement beside the stone lattice that concealed the balcony of his private quarters. Chani, no doubt. Hunting for sand in the desert, she'd called this venture. How little she understood the bitter choice. Selecting among agonies, he thought, made even lesser agonies near unbearable. For a blurred, emotionally painful moment, he relived their parting. At the last instant, Chani had experienced a tau glimpse of his feelings, which she had misinterpreted. She had thought his emotions were those experienced in the parting of loved ones when one entered the dangerous unknown. Would that I did not know, he thought. He had crossed the bridge now and entered the upper passageway through the office building. There were fixed glow globes here and people hurrying on business. The Khazarate never slept. Paul found his attention caught by the signs above doorways, as though he was seeing them for the first time. Speed merchants, wind stills and retorts, prophetic prospects, tests of faith, religious supply, weaponry, propagation of the faith. A more honest label would have been propagation of the bureaucracy, he thought. A type of religious civil servant had sprung up all through his universe. This new man of the Khazarate was more often a convert. He seldom displaced a Fremen in the key posts, but he was filling all the interstices. He used melange as much to show he could afford it as for the geriatric benefits. He stood apart from his rulers, Emperor, Guild, Bene Gesserit, Lanzarat, family, or Khazarate. His gods were routine and records. He was served by mentats and prodigious filing systems. Expediency was the first wound in his catechism, although he gave proper lip service to the precepts of the Butlerians. Machines could not be fashioned in the image of a man's mind, he said, but he betrayed by every action that he preferred machines to men, statistics to individuals, the faraway general view, to the intimate personal touch, requiring imagination and initiative. As Paul emerged onto the ramp at the far side of the building, he heard the bells calling the evening rite at Alia's fane. There was an odd feeling of permanence about the bells. The temple across the thronged square was new, its rituals of recent devising, but there was something about this setting in a desert sink at the edge of Arakeen, something in the way wind-driven sand had begun to weather stones and plastine, something in the haphazard way the buildings had gone up around the fane. Everything conspired to produce the impression that this was a very old place full of traditions and mystery. He was down into the press of people now, committed. The only guide his security force could find had insisted it be done this way. Security hadn't liked Paul's radio agreement. Stilgar had liked it even less, and Chani had objected most of all. The crowd round him, even while its members brushed against him, glanced his way unseeing and passed on, gave him a curious freedom of movement. It was the way they'd been conditioned to treat a Fremen, he knew. He carried himself like a man of the inner desert. Such men were quick to anger. As he moved into the quickening flow to the temple steps, the crush of people became even greater. Those all around could not help but press against him now, but he found himself the target for ritual apologies. Your pardon, noble sir. I cannot prevent this discourtesy. Pardon, sir. This crush of people is the worst I've ever seen. I abase myself, holy citizen. A lout shoved me. Paul ignored the words after the first few. There was no feeling in them except a kind of ritual fear. He found himself, instead, thinking that he had come a long way from his boyhood days in Caladan Castle, where he had put his foot on the path that led to this journey. Where had he put his foot on the path that led to this journey across a crowded square on a planet so far from Caladan? Had he really put his foot on a path? He could not say he had acted at any point in his life for one specific reason. The motives and impinging forces had been complex, more complex possibly than any other set of goals and goads in human history. He had the heady feeling here that he might still avoid the fate he could see so clearly along this path, but the crowd pushed him forward and he experienced the dizzy sense that he had lost his way, lost personal direction over his life. The crowd flowed with him up the steps now into the temple portico. Voices grew hushed. The smell of fear grew stronger, acrid, sweaty. Acolytes had already begun the service within the temple. Their plain chant dominated the other sounds, whispers, rustle of garments, shuffling feet, coughs, telling the story of the far places visited by the priestess in her holy trance. She rides the sandworms of space. She guides through all storms into the land of gentle winds. Though we sleep by the snake's den, she guards our dreaming souls, shunning the desert heat. She hides us in a cool hollow. The gleaming of her white teeth guides us in the night. By the braids of her hair we are lifted up to heaven. Sweet fragrance, flower-scented, surrounds us in her presence. Balak, Paul thought, drinking in Fremen. Look out. She can be filled with angry passion too. The temple portico was lined with tall, slender glow tubes simulating candle flame. They flickered. The flickering stirred ancestral memories in Paul, even while he knew that was the intent. This setting was an atavism, subtly contrived, effective. He hated his own hand in it. The crowd flowed with him through tall metal doors into the gigantic nave, a gloomy place with the flickering lights far away overhead, a brilliantly illuminated altar at the far end. Behind the altar, a deceptively simple affair of black wood encrusted with sand patterns above the encrusted with sand patterns from the Fremen mythology. Hidden lights played on the field of a prudor to create a rainbow borealis. The 7 rows of chanting acolytes ranked below that spectral curtain took on an eerie quality. Black robes, white faces, mouths moving in unison. Paul studied the pilgrims around him, suddenly envious of their intentness, their air of listening to truths he could not hear. It seemed to him that they gained something here which was denied to him, something mysteriously healing. He tried to inch his way closer to the altar, was stopped by a hand on his arm. Paul whipped his gaze around, met the probing stare of an ancient Fremen, blue eyes beneath overhanging brows, recognition in them. A name flashed into Paul's mind, Razir, a companion from the siege days. In the press of the crowd, Paul knew he was completely vulnerable if Razir planned violence. The old man pressed close, one hand beneath a sand-grimed robe, grasping the hilt of a creased knife, no doubt. Paul set himself as best he could to resist attack. The old man moved his head toward Paul's ear, whispered, "We will go with the others." It was the signal to identify his guide. Paul nodded. Razir drew back, faced the altar. "She comes from the east," the acolytes chanted. "The sun stands at her back. All things are exposed. In the full glare of light, her eyes miss nothing, neither light nor dark." A wailing rebaba jarred across the voices, stilled them, receded into silence. With an electric abruptness, the crowd surged forward several meters. They were packed into a tight mass of flesh now, the air heavy with their breathing and the scent of spice. "Shai Hulud writes on clean sand," the acolytes shouted. Paul felt his own breath catch in unison with those around him. A feminine chorus began singing faintly from the shadows, behind the shimmering prudor. Alia, Alia, Alia. It grew louder and louder, fell to a sudden silence. Again voices beginning vesper soft. "She stills all storms, her eyes kill our enemies, and torment the unbelievers. From the spires of Tuono, where dawnlight strikes, and clear water runs, you can see her shadow. In this shining summer heat, she serves us bread and milk, cool, fragrant with spices. Her eyes melt our enemies, torment our oppressors, and pierce all mysteries. She is Alia, 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 Alia." Slowly the voices trailed off. Paul felt sickened. What are we doing? He asked himself. Alia was a child witch, but she was growing older, and he thought, growing older is to grow more wicked. The collective mental atmosphere of the temple aided his psyche. He could sense that element of himself which was one with those all around him, but the differences formed a deadly contradiction. He stood immersed, isolated in a personal sin which he could never expiate. The immensity of the universe outside the temple flooded his awareness. How could one man, one ritual, hope to knit such immensity into a garment fitted to all men? Paul shuddered. The universe opposed him at every step. It eluded his grasp, conceived countless disguises to delude him. That universe would never agree with any shape he gave it. A profound hush spread through the temple. Alia emerged from the darkness behind the shimmering rainbows. She wore a yellow robe trimmed in Atreides green. Yellow for sunlight, green for the depth which produced life. Paul experienced the sudden surprising thought that Alia had emerged here just for him alone. He stared across the mob in the temple at his sister. She was his sister. He knew her ritual and its roots, but he had never before stood out here with the pilgrims, watched her through their eyes. Here, performing the mystery of this place, he saw that she partook of the universe which opposed him. Acolytes brought her a golden chalice. Alia raised the chalice. With part of his awareness, Paul knew that the chalice contained the unaltered melange, the subtle poison, her sacrament of the oracle. Her gaze on the chalice, Alia spoke. Her voice caressed the ears, flower sound, flowing and musical. "In the beginning we were empty," she said, "ignorant of all things," the chorus sang. "We did not know the power that abides in every place," Alia said, "and in every time," the choruses sang. "Here is the power," Alia said, raising the chalice slightly. "It brings us joy," sang the chorus, "and it brings us distress," Paul thought. "It awakens the soul," Alia said. "It dispels all doubts," the chorus sang. "In words we perish," Alia said. "In the power we survive," sang the chorus. Alia put the chalice to her lips, drank. To his astonishment, Paul found he was holding his breath like the meanest pilgrim of this mob. Despite every shred of personal knowledge about the experience Alia was undergoing, he had been caught in the tower web. He felt himself remembering how that fiery poison coursed into the body. Memory unfolded the time stopping when awareness became a mote which changed the poison. He re-experienced the awakening into timelessness where all things were possible. He knew Alia's present experience, yet he saw now that he did not know it. Mystery blinded the eyes. Alia trembled, sank to her knees. Paul exhaled with the enraptured pilgrims. He nodded. Part of the veil began to lift from him. Absorbed in the bliss of a vision, he had forgotten that each vision belonged to all those who were still on the way, still to become. In the vision, one passed through a darkness, unable to distinguish reality from insubstantial accident. One hungered for absolutes which could never be. Hungering, one lost the present. Alia swayed with the rapture of spice change. Paul felt that some transcendental presence spoke to him, saying, "Look, see there, see what you've ignored." In that instant, he thought he looked through other eyes, that he saw an imagery and rhythm in this place which no artist or poet could reproduce. It was vital and beautiful, a glaring light that exposed all power gluttony, even his own. Alia spoke. Her amplified voice boomed across the nave. "Luminous night," she cried. A moan swept like a wave through the crush of pilgrims. "Nothing hides in such a night," Alia said. "What rare light is this darkness? You cannot fix your gaze upon it. Senses cannot record it. No words can describe it." Her voice lowered. "The abyss remains. It is pregnant with all the things yet to be. Ah, what gentle violence." Paul felt that he waited for some private signal from his sister. It could be any action or word, something of wizardry and mystical processes. An outward streaming that would fit him like an arrow into a cosmic bow. This instant lay like quivering mercury in his awareness. "There will be sadness," Alia intoned. "I remind you all that things are but a beginning, forever beginning. Worlds wait to be conquered. Some within the sound of my voice will attain exalted destinies. You will sneer at the past, forgetting what I tell you now. Within all differences there is unity." Paul suppressed a cry of disappointment as Alia lowered her head. She had not said the thing he waited to hear. His body felt like a dry shell, a husk abandoned by some desert insect. Others must feel something similar, he thought. He sensed the restlessness about him. Abruptly, a woman in the mob, someone far down in the nave to Paul's left, cried out, a wordless noise of anguish. Alia lifted her head, and Paul had the giddy sensation that the distance between them collapsed, that he stared directly into her glazed eyes only inches away from her. "Who summons me?" Alia asked. "I do," the woman cried. "I do, Alia. Oh, Alia, help me. They say my son was killed on Muratan. Is he gone? Will I never see my son again? Never? You try to walk backward in the sand," Alia intoned. "Nothing is lost. Everything returns later, but you may not recognize the changed form that returns." "Alia, I don't understand," the woman wailed. "You live in the air, but you do not see it," Alia said, sharpness in her voice. "Are you a lizard? Your voice has the Fremen accent. Does a Fremen try to bring back the dead? What do we need from our dead except their water?" Down in the centre of the nave, a man in a rich red cloak lifted both hands, the sleeves falling to expose white-clad arms. "Alia," he shouted, "I have had a business proposal. Should I accept? You come here like a beggar," Alia said. "You look for the golden bowl, but you will find only a dagger." "I have been asked to kill a man," a voice shouted from off to the right, a deep voice of siege tones. "Should I accept? Accepting, would I succeed? Beginning and end are a single thing," Alia snapped. "Have I not told you this before? You didn't come here to ask that question. What is it you cannot believe that you must come here and cry out against it?" "She's in a fierce mood tonight," a woman near Paul muttered. "Have you ever seen her this angry?" "She knows I'm out here," Paul thought. "Did she see something in the vision that angered her? Is she raging at me?" "Alia," a man directly in front of Paul called, "tell these businessmen and faint-hearts how long your brother will rule." "I permit you to look around that corner by yourself," Alia snarled. "You carry your prejudice in your mouth. It is because my brother rides the worm of chaos that you have roof and water." With a fierce gesture, clutching her robe, Alia whirled away, strode through the shimmering ribbons of light, was lost in the darkness behind. Immediately the acolytes took up the closing chant, but their rhythm was off. Obviously they'd been caught by the unexpected ending of the rite. An incoherent mumbling arose on all sides of the crowd. Paul felt the stirring around him, restless, dissatisfied. It was that fool with his stupid question about business, a woman near Paul muttered. The hypocrite. What had Alia seen? What track through the future? Something had happened here tonight, souring the rite of the oracle. Usually the crowd clamoured for Alia to answer their pitiful questions. They came as beggars to the oracle, yes. He had heard them thus many times as he'd watched, hidden in the darkness behind the altar. What had been different about this night? The old Fremen tugged Paul's sleeve, nodded toward the exit. The crowd already was beginning to push in that direction. Paul allowed himself to be pressed along with them, the guide's hand upon his sleeve. There was the feeling in him that his body had become the manifestation of some power he could no longer control. He'd become a non-being, a stillness which moved itself. At the core of the non-being there he existed, allowing himself to be led through the streets of his city, following a track so familiar to his visions that it froze his heart with grief. I should know what Alia saw, he thought. I have seen it enough times myself. And she didn't cry out against it. She saw the alternatives, too.